Do you understand what I'm telling you? You can return to your life, Miss Hammond. Do you want to live, boy? Blood of my blood.
So, hair tends to mean something to the vast majority of people regardless of gender. Therefore, loss of hair as a dramatic plot point, which is what this video is about, is of course not something reserved solely for women. But let me explain why I think the instances of this happening to female characters is in a complete league of its own, deserving of a separate category. When it comes to male characters, a scene in Boyhood springs to mind as being incredibly relatable. When Mason is around 10, his stepfather implements a strict parenting style, which includes forcing Mason to get a haircut.
He didn't even ask. He just cut it. It's my hair.
As with the entirety of Boyhood, even the scenarios that aren't a direct parallel to my life, emotionally they are hitting a beat that I 100% experienced. When you're like a toddler, you couldn't care less what you look like, but at 10 you are both old enough to know what you want, but not old enough to make your own decisions. There's something about hair, more so than clothing for example, that's way more personal. It's a physical part of your body, so to not have autonomy over that, and being forced to sit in a barber's chair, while not a big deal to the adults in the room, feels like the end of the world to you as a child. And that's why when Mason is a teenager and has a bit more autonomy, he lets his hair flow, which is exactly what I did as well. Boyhood uses this emotional, relatable beat of being a young boy, and then directs those negative feelings onto the stepfather, which serves as the first glimpse of what is going to be an escalatingly abusive figure in his life. So here, and in Breaking Bad, and 50-50, and Short Term 12, and many others, we see head shaving used in a pretty useful and memorable way that makes a narrative point. But still, when I think of the most visually striking scenes, the ones steeped in symbolism or signifying a seismic shift in the narrative, the top of my list is full of women and God. And I believe that this is because of the word sacrifice. The god in question is Aslan, Jesus but a lion, and I can't think of a more perfect place to start to illustrate the point of loss of hair and sacrifice. A lion's mane signifies health, strength, age, and experience, and none more so than in the case of Aslan. On the night where he walks to his death, Aslan is accompanied by Susan and Lucy who couldn't sleep. Right as they are approaching the stone table, he asks them to lay their hands on his mane so he can feel their presence. It is something the girls had longed to do ever since they first saw him, but would never dare touch his mane without permission. Now that they have it, they bury their hands deep in what is described as a golden, beautiful sea of fur. He asks them to go hide, and as they say goodbye, they kiss his mane. Then his sacrifice begins.
But he made no noise, even when the enemies, straining and tugging, pulled the cord so tight that they cut into his flesh. Then they began to drag him toward the stone table.
"Stop!"
said the witch.
"Let him first be shaved."
Another roar of mean laughter went up from her followers as an ogre with a pair of shears came forward and squatted down by Aslan's head. Snip, snip, snip went the shears, and masses of curling gold began to fall to the ground. Then the ogre stood back, and the children, watching from their hiding place, could see the face of Aslan, looking all small and different without its mane. The enemies also saw the difference.
"Why, he's only a great cat after all,"
cried one. "Is that what we were afraid of?" said another.
Sacrifice, the act of giving up something that is valuable to you in order to help someone else. Aslan giving up his life to save Edmund is one thing, but the scene is so effective because it goes beyond that. As they cut his mane, they are stripping him of a symbol of his majesty, stripping him of his pride and dignity, and visually it is the most heart-wrenching image that shows his physical vulnerability. The girls watching this horrific scene can only think of how small his face looks. The enemies surrounding him mock his appearance, how beneath his golden cloak of fur, he looks like a meek, ordinary cat. In a way, it's a more devastating image than the loss of life itself. Aslan lets this all happen willingly. He endures this humiliation in order to save Edmund and save Narnia. This is the bar for depth and symbolism that I'm looking for, and here's how it tends to be women that meet it. V for Vendetta is set in a dystopian, fascist-ruled Britain, and we follow the character of Evie Hammond, a young woman struggling under an oppressive regime who maintained power through surveillance and fear. Evie's life changes when she crosses paths with a vigilante wearing a Guy Fawkes mask who goes by the name of V. V is committed to dismantling the regime, and through his influence, Evie is drawn into a world of rebellion. But there's a problem. She still struggles with the personal risks associated with opposing an authoritarian government. In fact, early in their relationship, Evie becomes overwhelmed by V's ruthlessness and chooses to flee rather than fully align herself with his radical approach. So here we have a woman being held back by fear and is in need of a transformation. This defining moment comes when she's captured and undergoes a brutal imprisonment in what she believes is a government facility. And at the very start of this ordeal, her head is shaved, an act that clearly causes an intense amount of distress. All she has to do to put a stop to this is cooperate with the government and betray the resistance. Evie's head getting shaved is the physical representation of her being stripped of the identity she once had in a fearful society, to do away with her former self so she can evolve into a fearless woman fully committed to V's vision. And that evolution happens. The fear in her eyes is gone, and even when threatened with death, she doesn't budge, she feels nothing. Evie is then released, and it's immediately revealed that this was all fake. It was orchestrated by V. It was not a government facility. She was never actually at risk of getting executed. It was all a test to see if she could free herself from fear, and she passed. The head shaving is more than just a symbolic transformation. It represents her sacrifice, in exchange for camaraderie, in exchange for helping society. By embracing V's ideals of freedom and justice, she sacrifices her attachments to safety, comfort, and her previous identity. Speaking of head shaving in secret facilities for the greater good, it does kind of mirror 11 in Stranger Things, though this one has its own unique spin. Unlike the other women featured in this video, 11 is not introduced to us as having long flowing hair. She's a young, mysterious girl with psychokinetic abilities and a shaved head. The reason for this is because she was essentially a lab rat subjected to cruel experiments. 11's lack of hair in the earlier seasons symbolizes her status as a test subject, stripped of her individuality and her autonomy. But as the series progresses and she escapes the confines of the lab and finds a new family with Mike, Dustin, and Lucas, she gradually grows into her identity, learning to embrace her powers while also grappling with the psychological scars from her past. And you can physically see this growth by simply looking at the growth of her hair. However, by season 4, a new threat emerges from the Upside Down, which prompts the need for 11 to regain the full extent of her powers. So she finds herself in the Nina Project, where in order to access her memories and enhance her abilities, she will go through a series of tests that all begin with shaving her head. If her past shaved head symbolized her status as a lab rat, her head getting shaved again represents her need to confront her past, to embrace the painful truths that come with her origins. That moment where she wakes up and a single tear falls, she raises her hands to her head and more tears fall as she cries out no. It's pretty powerful. It's a direct visual representation of the sacrifice she's already begun to make. Like Evie, she is sacrificing comfort, but even further, she is sacrificing the identity she worked so hard to grow into and returning to one that caused her so much pain. She gave up something valuable to her in order to save her friends. Now, I have to get to my favorite visual loss of hair scene in this video. I say visual because, much to my distress, my absolute favorite case overall didn't get a visual. We'll get to Daenerys, but first, let's talk about Mulan. Mulan is an interesting one because at a first glance, you may not count it as sacrifice. It seems much more like freedom, breaking off the chains. Her hair is not something she values. In fact, her entire I Want song is about how her reflection doesn't match what's inside. Her appearance, which is that of a woman, has led to certain expectations, being a perfect bride and perfect daughter, and she doesn't feel like she's capable of playing that part. It's only until she's short-haired Ping that she finally hits her stride. People might group Mulan and Merida, for example, as the same type of character. I don't know, tomboyish young girls who don't fit in with their traditional family values and expectations and therefore rebel. And sure, but how I think they differ is, unlike Merida, Mulan wasn't initially rebellious. That wasn't part of her character. When we are introduced to her, she is actively trying her best to fit in with her parents' expectations. And yes, her best was awful. Throughout that opening 14 minutes culminating in reflection, she was clumsy and unpunctual, and it led to disaster, but she was trying. I mean, let's compare the catalyst that pushed both of them to finally break free from their suffocating lives. With Merida, it was because she was betrothed, so she ran away and made a deal with a witch. As is her right, by the way, I'm not criticizing the character. But that is completely different to Mulan, which actually had nothing to do with her. It was so she could save her father's life. Merida ran away so she could change her mother. Mulan ran away to save her father. She wasn't under the impression that disguising herself as a man would lead to so much personal growth and that she'd be an incredible recruit for the army. It was completely selfless. So Mulan cutting her hair is for sure a sacrifice. Not just sacrificing the values of her parents, but her own desire to fit in and not break their heart, sacrificing the dream of being the perfect daughter. I love this whole haircut sequence. I love how there's no setup for the fact that Mulan is even thinking of doing something like this. She goes from crying in the rain to something immediately switching in her head. She furls her eyebrows and is off to do what she needs to do. She goes from one task to the next so quickly and smoothly, but what I find so clever is that within each section of this sequence, she's given a moment's pause that lasts just a second. First, when she prays to her ancestors, signaling that she's aware of the fact that she's doing something incredibly dangerous and she'll need all the help she can get. Thanks, Mushu. The next is when she's stealing her father's conscription notice and replacing it with her flower comb. She takes a second to look at them as they sleep, and it's not a look of regret or questioning whether she should carry on. It was a look of love and I'm sorry. Then, when she raises her father's sword to her long hair, there's a tiny moment's hesitation, but she scrunches her face and slices through her hair. The final one is just as she's about to leave. She pauses, she takes a look back at her home, and then she's off. She didn't take joy in any part of the sequence, because it is not a breaking off the chains, freedom kind of moment, it is sacrifice. Compare this with Rapunzel, which is for sure a breaking off the chains moment, but also in a way that signals sacrifice. In the original version of the fairy tale, Rapunzel is a girl imprisoned in a tower by a sorceress. Her impossibly long, golden hair, which the sorceress uses to enter the tower, becomes a symbol of hope and escape when she allows a prince to climb her hair as well. However, when the sorceress learns of this, she cuts off Rapunzel's hair in anger and banishes her into the wilderness. It's hard to make the case that this is a sacrificial act on anyone's part. It was something forced upon Rapunzel, and as for the sorceress, sure, she is giving up her means of entering the tower, but to what benefit? It was just pure anger. But then we get to Disney's version, Tangled, and they made some changes that I absolutely love. In this adaptation, Rapunzel's hair possesses magical properties, allowing it to heal wounds and prevent aging. Mother Gothel keeps Rapunzel locked away in a tower to exploit this power and sustain her youth. Here, Rapunzel's hair symbolizes the physical and emotional hold that Gothel has over her. Jumping to the climax of the movie, the cutting of Rapunzel's hair represents the chains being broken and her liberation. And yeah, it's still hard to make the case that it's Rapunzel herself making a sacrifice, because she's not the one who willingly cut it. In fact, the sacrifice she wants to make is to stay with Gothel, continue being trapped in the tower if it means sparing Flynn's life, and Mother Gothel agrees.
Just let me heal him, and you and I will be together. Forever, just like you want. Everything will be the way it was. I promise.
It's the opposite. Keeping her hair rather than cutting it would be the sacrifice. So having it be Flynn or Eugene who cuts her hair was genius. He was sacrificing the only thing that could heal his mortal wound. He did it so she could be freed from the hold Gothel had on her. A selfless act, one Rapunzel was completely blindsided by. So if you then hold up the sacrifice she was willing to make and the one he was willing to make, together it is such a touching, romantic symbol of mutual sacrifice shared between them. The only reason she could get near him, close enough for him to slice through her hair, is because she made a genuine offer of sacrifice to Gothel. If they had Rapunzel cut off her own hair, i.e. break off her own chains, that would be cool. But it wouldn't hit the same in this scenario because she wouldn't be giving up something of immense value to her. With the way Disney did it, both of them were making the biggest sacrifice they could make in that moment, and it's perfect. Loss of hair is often used as a stark visual representation of a character at rock bottom, and it's hard to think of anyone this applies to more than Fantine in Les Mis. Fantine is a young, working-class woman in 19th century France. Her life spirals into poverty after she loses her job at the factory due to the prejudice of her employers, who discover she has an illegitimate child, Cosette. Alone and destitute, Fantine is left with few options to support her daughter, whom she has entrusted to the care of a cruel couple who demand increasingly exorbitant payments for Cosette's upkeep. In her desperation to keep sending money, Fantine makes a series of painful sacrifices that escalate in severity. One of those early sacrifices is her hair. For a small amount of money, she's forced to sell a symbol of her youth, beauty, and most importantly, dignity. And from here, things get so much worse. She sells her teeth, an act that adds a tremendous amount of physical pain on top of the emotional agony she was going through. And lastly, she sells her entire body, stripping her of any remaining self-worth. Loss of hair is the obvious starting point to kick off her spiral. Since hair strands don't have nerves, the physical stakes are absolutely nothing compared to teeth pulling, but emotionally, it's up there. It represents her crossing to a point where her body becomes a commodity to be exploited. And because hair just doesn't simply grow back immediately, the commodification of her body is a constant reminder that she has to carry with her every second of every day. It is constant for the audience as well, an instant, clear signal of how drastically her life has descended into poverty, made all the more devastating by the fact that she isn't even doing this for herself, so she can eat or have a roof over her head. She's doing it for Cosette. It is an act of heartbreaking sacrifice that embodies the selflessness of a mother's love. From this point on, we're going to need to switch the definitions of sacrifice, to give up something for something else considered more important. Now, all of the examples above can clearly fit this definition, but none of the following examples can fit above, because their acts of sacrifice are not for someone else's benefit, but their own. And coincidentally, all of them are from A Song of Ice and Fire.
What do we say to the god of death?
Not today.
From the moment of Arya's final dancing lesson, her identity becomes a liability. The stakes become even higher when her father is executed right in front of her. So, in order to save her life, Yoren cuts her hair and disguises her as a boy so she can travel up to Winterfell as someone other than Arya Stark.
Keep your mouth shut, boy.
I'm not a boy!
You're not a smart boy, is that what you're trying to say? North, boy. We're going north.
Here's how that haircutting moment plays out in the book.
"I'm not," she started. He shoved her into a doorway, thrust dirty fingers through her hair, gave it a twist, yanking her head back.
Not a smart boy. That what you mean to say?
He had a knife in his other hand. As the blade flashed toward her face, Arya threw herself backward, kicking wildly, wrenching her head from side to side. But he had her by the hair so strong she could feel her scalp tearing, and on her lips the salt taste of tears.
I adore both these versions. They both hit deep for me, but while you might think that they are pretty much the same thing, the version that plays out on screen ties way more into the theme of sacrifice than the novel. At first, they are the same. Arya is fighting his grip and insisting she's not a boy despite the absurdity of trying to correct him. Absurdity that I'm sure Arya was aware of because she knows him, he knows her, and she knows that he doesn't actually think she's a boy. But still, Arya insists on correcting him, which is a heartbreaking detail because this is her still trying to hold on to her identity. This is the last moment that she will be Arya Stark, daughter of Ned Stark. She's about to embark on a very long journey of her hiding her identity, the one thing that ties her to a father who was just beheaded moments ago. Where they then diverge is, in the book, she continues to try to fight him off, kicking wildly and wrenching her head from side to side as he cuts her hair. But in the show, as Arya is resisting, he snaps her out of it by very bluntly yelling at her.
Do you want to live, boy?
The acting in this scene from young Maisie Williams is so incredible because as he shouts that, you can immediately see in her eyes the fear and acknowledgement of the stakes. She stops fighting him off, she stops insisting she's a girl, she lets him cut her hair, and along with it, her identity as Arya Stark. It's sacrifice, one that she's making for her own survival. When Cersei is imprisoned by the Faith Militant, she weighs out her options for freedom and realizes that confessing and doing the Walk of Atonement is all she has. Now, Cersei is an interesting one because she would probably tell you that she doesn't belong in this section of the video. She would genuinely believe she belongs with the likes of Fontaine, that her sacrifice was for her son Tommen, who she deeply loves. And it's not necessarily that she's lying when she says she loves her children. But Cersei's version of love is a very specific, narcissistic kind. She loves them purely because they are an extension of herself. It's the same reason she loves Jaime, and that's because, above all, Cersei loves Cersei.
Her enemies were accusing her of treason. She had to reach Tommen, no matter the cost. He loves me. He will not refuse his own mother. Joff was stubborn and unpredictable, but Tommen is a good little boy, a good little king. He will do as he's told. If she stayed here, she was doomed, and the only way she would return to the Red Keep was by walking.
This is exactly what I'm talking about. It takes us right into her head, and all she's thinking about is herself. Tommen, who she loves, is just a footnote, an extension of her that she can use to carry out her wishes. That's what is driving her desire to get to the Red Keep. That's why she makes the sacrifice.
They brought lye soap, a basin of warm water, a pair of shears, and a long, straight razor. The sight of the steel sent a shiver through her. They mean to shave me. A little more humiliation, a raisin for my porridge. She would not give them the pleasure of hearing her beg. I am Cersei of House Lannister, a Lion of the Rock, the rightful queen of these 7 kingdoms, true-born daughter of Tywin Lannister, and hair grows back. Get on with it, she said.
A lovely little excerpt where she's trying to say, no big deal, it's just hair, which is the mentality she desperately attempts to maintain throughout the entire Walk of Atonement. It's just a walk, it will be over soon. They are peasants, I'm a queen. But even within the cell, as she's getting her hair cut off, she has these intrusive thoughts that reveal how devastating the ordeal is for her.
Drifts of golden hair fell to the floor. She had not been allowed to tend it properly, penned up in the cell, but even unwashed and tangled, it shone where the sun touched it. My crown, the queen thought. They took the other crown away from me, and now they're stealing this one as well.
After her body is also shaved, she feels vulnerable and remarks at how she doesn't even have a single strand of hair to hide behind. And as the whole Walk of Atonement builds up, she tries her best to keep it together until finally the tears fall from her eyes and burn down her cheeks like acid. It's a brutal, graphic chapter. And look, to her credit, while she may not be up there with Fontaine in terms of making a sacrifice for someone else, she is pretty close in terms of the physical and mental severity of her ordeal. One that she accepted. None of this would happen to her without her confession. None of it would happen without her agreement. She was aware of the terms. Yet Cersei made that sacrifice because there was something more important to her. Freedom, power, and vanquishing her enemies. Something she's rewarded with at the end of this chapter. So now for my absolute favorite, which might even be the most under-discussed case of hair sacrifice in this video, Daenerys. Dany's story in the first book and first season is an absolute wild ride of the highest highs and lowest lows, one that I'm obsessed with. She starts off in a bleak situation, in exile, being sold off by her abusive brother to a warlord, yet most of the events to come are things going really well for her. Her brother gets eliminated, Khal Drogo falls completely in love with her and she loves him. She convinces him to sail across the narrow sea and win back the Iron Throne for her. She's pregnant with a son, prophesied to be the stallion who mounts the world. And then it all comes crashing down hard. She loses her husband, she loses her son, she loses most of the Dothraki, A crash that is so hard and so depressing that some might even abandon following the series because of it. At least that's what Brandon Sanderson says was his breaking point. But the reason the crash is so worth it to me is because it sets the stage for her final scene. As her husband is getting cremated, Daenerys steps into the flames and walks directly into Drogo's funeral pyre.
When the fire died at last, and the ground became cool enough to walk upon, Sir Jorah Mormont found her amidst the ashes, surrounded by blackened logs and bits of glowing ember, and the burnt bones of man and woman and stallion. She was covered with soot, her clothes turned to ash, her beautiful hair all crisped away. Yet she was unhurt.
In her arms, Daenerys cradled 2 baby dragons and a third draped across her shoulder. Now, it's no surprise the bald head doesn't get much attention. Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion are the stars of the show, and it was such a side note that they even took it out of the series. Unlike Arya and Cersei, which were essential moments of them losing their hair, Dany losing her hair honestly isn't that important, but it's important to me. In Dothraki culture, hair is a powerful symbol of strength and victory in battle. They grow their hair into a long braid as a testament of their undefeated status. When a warrior loses, he is required to cut his braid. Loss of hair as a disgraceful mark of failure and defeat. But just because it's culture does not make it fact. Daenerys stepping into the fire is her embracing what she's lost, but not as a sign of weakness and defeat, but as a means of being reborn. Her hair getting burned off contrasts Dothraki norm because while they carry around loss of hair with shame and humiliation, for her it happens in a world-shaking moment of triumph. And that's another thing about this case that makes it stand out. It isn't depressing. Yes, this was Daenerys at rock bottom, but unlike the other cases where the loss of hair marks the beginning of an ordeal, hers marks the beginning of her ascent. She is literally rising from the ashes. It is a cathartic shedding of all the misery we have just seen her experience. And just because it's triumph doesn't mean it's not sacrifice. Daenerys tried so hard to hold on to Drogo. She felt like she needed him. She inadvertently traded her son's life for him. This is her letting go of that, making the active choice to move on, surrendering herself to the flames so they can strip away the last remnants of her former life, a life that was going really well for her. She sacrifices that so she can claim her destiny. Because for the first time in hundreds of years, the night would come alive with the music of dragons.